The top 10 cities where home prices will crash in 2025. That's what we're talking about today on the Housing Nerd. I'm also going to show you at the end of this video where home prices may land next year according to 15 different expert opinions. You don't want to miss today's Housing Nerd video all about 2025. But first, you got to do a little work for me. I'm already putting in the work for you. Hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, subscribe to the Housing Nerd. If you haven't yet, what are you waiting on? Also, comment below. I want to know what's happening in your neck of the woods with housing. What madness are you seeing in the housing market? I want to know. Comment below. All right, let's get going. Okay, so to figure out where home prices could crash and may crash in 2025, the top 10 cities, I used three things. I looked at three different pieces of data. One, I looked at active inventory. Where is active inventory growing the most compared to pre-pandemic? I also looked at days on market growth. Where are homes taking longer to sell the most? Where's that time grown the most since 2019? So that's days on market. That's my second criteria. Third criteria is prices. I've looked at where prices have fallen the most since the 2022 peak. A lot of home markets, a lot of housing markets had their peak in home prices at some point in 2022. So I'm comparing 2022 to prices now and seeing where prices have already fallen. And I'm really curious what you think about my methodology and the list I came up with. Let's take a look at it right now. Okay, so here are my three charts here with my three data sets. I've got active listings, I have days on market, and I have the price change. And so what I did was I looked at where inventory has grown the most since 2019, since November of 2019 compared to now. And then I found out if that city is on the top list of days on market growth and on the top list of price decline since the peak in 2022, and that gave me my top 10 list. So what we'll do is we'll review this chart, this data set, and review my top 10. But I'm going to zoom in to some maps to give you a better visual of where prices and inventory has gone over the last several years. And I think this will tell you, kind of paints the picture of why I selected these cities. So number one on the list, Colorado Springs. As far as active listings go, it actually took the number one spot in the U.S., 72% growth in active listings compared to 2019. So now if I look at days on market, I can also see 34% growth in days on market. It's taking 34% longer to sell a home in Colorado Springs right now than it did back in 2019. And then you can see it's on the list of price decline as well, down 6.82% since the peak in 2022. So check this out. Now let's go to the map, and here's Colorado Springs, Colorado. This is the inventory picture. You can see shift between November 2019, November 2024, 72%. But look at the inventory numbers. You can see back in 2019, they had 1,700 units for sale. Now, November 2024, 2,900 units, almost 3,000 units. That's a big difference, right? When you only have 3,000 units total and you've grown 1,000 units, that's a big jump, right? So obviously you get that 72%. All right. So that's active listings. Now, let's look at price change. So price change for Colorado Springs, Colorado, you can see shift since the 2022 peak down 6.8%. But look at the 1 year change. 1 year change is only up 0.8%. 2 year change, if you look at all of the 2 years, all of 2022, you can see it's only up 0.1%. So they still have a growth of 36.9% in a 5 years. And so this can be a little confusing, but the shift since the peak is down 6.8%, meaning at some point in 2022, home prices were actually 6.8% higher than they are right now, even though the 2 year change from November to November is only 0.1%. But the important part there, folks, is that we're down in Colorado Springs, Colorado, 6.8% down since the peak. So that's definitely in my top 10. All right, now let's go to the next city and see what we have. Next city, Austin, Texas, up 42%. 42% in inventory compared to 2019. Now, notice there are 3 other cities on this list where inventory has grown more than Austin, but I didn't find them on my other 2 data sets, so I skipped down to Austin. So 42% growth in active listings. Austin now makes the list here. 28% in days on market growth. So it's taking 28% longer to sell a house in Austin than it did back in 2019. Then look at the price change in Austin. Look at that. They're actually on the top of the tier here, down 22% since the peak in 2022. That's the price change, down 22% since the peak they had in 2022. That's a lot. I definitely consider that already crashed, right? So let's look at it on a map. Let's go to Austin. Austin, Texas, in inventory, 42.5% gain in inventory from 2019 to 2024 in November. Look back in November of 2019, they had 6,800, almost 7,000 units for sale. Now they have 9,800 units, another 2,000. This is actually like an 8-year high in inventory for Austin. So I definitely think that prices could come down more. Now let's look at prices there while we're talking about prices in Austin and see what we can find. Austin down, as you could see from my info earlier, down 22% since the peak. Look at this. 1-year change, they're down 3.4% year over year. 2-year change, down 11% from November to November. 3-year change, down 8.6%. They're still up 38% from 5 years ago. So that's pretty telling, right? Like they're still up from 5 years, 38%. What's that, like over 7% per year on average? So they're still trending well over the last 5 years, but they're certainly not growing at the pace they were. And now they're actually falling in home prices, not only from the peak, but 3-year change, 2-year change, and 1-year change are all down in Austin. I would look for that to continue. A lot of it has to do with inventory. All right, let's go back to my crash city map or chart here and see what we can find. All right. So next one on the list, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Florida, 36% growth in inventory since the peak. I'm sorry, since the before the pandemic. Then you come down, Cape Coral, where are you? Right here. 16% growth in days on markets, taking 16% longer to sell a home. Then over here, down 9.23% in prices since the peak in 2022. So let's look at the map. All right, the map tells us, if I go to Cape Coral, Florida, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Florida, look at this. We are obviously up 36.8% in inventory since 2019. But look at the growth now. I mean, again, it's an 8-year high. This is an 8-year high of inventory. Back in 2019, 8,000 units. Now 2024, almost 11,000. But go all the way back to November of 2016, we have more inventory than we've had in the last 8 years in Cape Coral, Florida. So a lot of inventory there. There's no doubt it's taking longer to sell homes, and prices are already declining. So check this out. Let's look at prices and see what we can find. Prices in Cape Coral, Florida, down 9.2% since the peak. 1-year change, 5.9%. 2-year change, 6.4% down. 3-year change still up from 3 years ago at 11.5. 4-year change still up 45%. Look at the 5-year change, still up 56% since the 5-year change. So one of the things you should get from this exercise today is that just because a housing market has dropped in prices over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, doesn't mean people who bought 5, 6 years ago still aren't sitting pretty. I mean, 56% change, in 5 years, that's over 10% annual growth. That outpaces the national average growth, that you see of like 5, 6% on average. So Cape Coral, even though it's struggled the last couple of years, has a long way to go before it's cataclysmic Armageddon for people who purchased, 5 years ago. Obviously, you can see from the data yourself. All right. Now, let's go back to my chart, my crash chart, I guess you call it. Next on my list is Spokane, Washington, up 33.2% since 2019 in inventory. Days on market, up 14.89% since 2019, November of 2019. Now, how are they doing with prices? They're down 6.15%. So now let's look at the map. Here's Spokane, Washington. And by the way, if I haven't said this already, I'm using Resiclub Analytic data. I may not have said it earlier, but I should have. But Resiclub has better data than almost anyone else I've seen on the net. I mean, these guys, Lance Lambert at Resiclub Analytics has it together. Links in my description below. If you care about the housing market, you want to really know what's going on, got to subscribe to Lance's info. All right, so Spokane, Washington, in inventory, 33% growth in houses for sale. Now, look at that, 1,600 units right now. Back in November 2020, they only had 614 units. November 2019, they had 1,200 units for sale. So definitely growth in active listings in Spokane, Washington. Now, let's look at prices. What have they done in Spokane? Let's look at Spokane, Washington prices. Spokane, Washington, you can see shifts since the 2022 peak down 6.2%. 1 year change, 1.2% growth. 2 year change, altogether, November to November in 2 years, you've got up 0.4% growth. 3 year change, up 6.2. Look at the 5 year, up 50%. So if you think about a 5 year change and you're up 50%, again, just like what we look at just now, Cape Coral, Florida, you're still up 10%, each year over the last 5 years in Spokane. So the wheels aren't off the bus yet. But if you purchased back in the peak, in that small window in the peak of 2022, now your home is worth 6.2% less, according to Zillow data and Lance Lambert. So that's what's happening with Spokane, Washington. Now let's look at the next one, which is Denver. Got Denver on the list, up 30%, 18% in inventory, active listings, days on market in Denver, up 18% in days on market. It's taking 18% longer to sell houses in Denver than it did in November of 2019. Then you go to prices. Where are they on prices? Down 7.38%. Okay, so in Denver, home prices now are 7% less than they were in the 2022 peak. So let's look at the map, give us a little bit more data. Let's go out to the mountains here. Whoops, let me just center my screen for you. Denver, Colorado, shift since the peak in active listings, up 30.2%. Inventory, look at the inventory. 9,351 units right now at the very bottom there in that white box that you want to pay attention to. That is a 8-year high. Got a lot of 8-year highs here on inventory. That's where home prices will fall the most, folks, in my opinion. There's going to be outliers, but that's where home prices are going to fall the most, where inventory is exploding the most. And where inventory is growing the most, you got more options with buyers, for buyers, and sellers have more competition, obviously lower prices. So that's what's happening with Denver and inventory. Now let's look at the change in prices in Denver and see what we see. In Denver, down 7.4% from the 2022 peak. That's a 5-year change, though. They're still up 34%. So it's not as great as Spokane or Florida, but certainly they are still up 34%, approximately 5% each year, about the national average for home price appreciation. So it looks like year over year, 2-year change, 3-year change, 4-year change, they haven't dropped at all. But if you look at that window in 2022, where they had the highest home prices, where they peaked in 2022, they're off 7.4% from that peak. Pretty astonishing, right? So let's go back to the crash city chart here and look at the next one. Phoenix. A lot of people think Phoenix is done for. So are they? Well, let's look. 23% growth, almost 24% growth in active inventory. Now let's look at Days on market, 22.73% longer to sell a home in Phoenix right now than it did back in 2019. Now let's look at prices, down 8.79% since the peak. Okay, let's go to the maps. Phoenix right here. Lance pointed it out for us on the map so we don't have to find it and hunt for it. Up 24% in inventory. Look at that, 16,000 units for sale, not even close to where they have been as far as an 8-year high, like some of the other cities we saw. You know, looks like the 8-year high is November 2016. They had 19,000 units. Will they get there? Who knows? But now they've got 16,000 units for sale. Let's look at prices. Prices down 8.8% in prices. We know that since the peak. 4-year change. Whoops, sorry, move that. Down, it's down 0.4% one year over year. Last 2 years down 0.6%. Look at the 5-year change though, 54%, similar to some of those other cities we looked at like Spokane and Cape Coral, where you're still up, you know, the end of the day, you're still up 10%, over 10% yearly in home appreciation. So if you bought, 6, 7, 10 years ago, you're still living large. It's not like it's the end of the world for you. And you can kind of see how much of a decline it'll take to see prices come back to 2022, 2019 levels. It would take like price declines of cataclysmic levels. I hope you're seeing that. Okay. Let's go back to the crash city chart, see what we can get. San Antonio's next, 23% growth in active inventory. San Antonio, 20% longer to sell a home. And San Antonio, Texas on price decline down 8.26. Let's find out what's happening in San Antonio, Texas with inventory. San Antonio, Texas. Where are they here? They're right here, right? There we go. San Antonio, Texas, up 23% in inventory. 2024 active units, 11,541. That's an 8-year high by far. Look at that. Not even any year doesn't even come close to hitting that number. So San Antonio's got a lot of inventory. If you're in San Antonio, comment below, or any of these cities. I'd love to know what you think of my methodology. What do you think of this info? Are we headed for a crash in these cities? Find out. All right. Now let's do prices in San Antonio. Is a Riverwalk going to crash? I don't know. Let's find out. All right. Shift since the peak in 2022, down 8.3%. 1-year change down 2.4%. 2-year change down 5.3%. 3-year change up 4.1%. Look at the 5-year change, 32%. Nothing like it was in Phoenix, where they're still in the 50s as far as 5-year change in prices. But it's still not a complete crash, right? I mean, you're still up. What's that? 6%, near 6% yearly in home prices over the last 5 years. So again, not if you purchased 6 years ago, 7 years ago, you've owned your house for 10 years, life's good. Even if you purchased it 4 years ago, you're still up 22%. So it's not completely over for you, right? Okay, let's do the next one. Next one on my list. New Orleans, up 18%. New Orleans is up 18% in active inventory. Now, let's look at New Orleans. Days on market, up 12%, basically 13. I'm bad at rounding, I guess. So 13% longer to sell a home in New Orleans. Now, let's look at prices. They're actually second in the biggest price declines since the peak in 2022, down 14.7%. So they're definitely hurting with prices already since the peak. Now let's find out how they've changed in detail. So New Orleans, I'll center it here, right here. Shift since the peak, up 18%. They've got 5,300 units for sale right now. That is an 8-year high. So it's still more inventory than they've seen in the last 8 years. Not a great sign if you want prices to continue to appreciate. And it's a good sign if you want prices to come down in New Orleans. All right, now let's look at prices in New Orleans. Oops. Prices in New Orleans. Shift since the peak down 14.8%. Look at this, all negative except 5 years, and that's only up 4%. So big difference, right? Between New Orleans, Austin, even San Antonio, just next door. You've got prices there basically growing at a normal rate over the last 5 years based on what we've seen, how the prices have come up and then came down. You average it out. But in New Orleans, look at this. I mean, down 1.9% 1 year, down 10% or 11% 2 year, down 11% 3 year, down 2.7% 4 year, and in 5 years, only up 4.2%. Tells the story. Active inventory matters, folks. It matters. Supply and demand. Learned it in the 7th grade. So you can apply your 7th grade economics class to what we're seeing right now in the housing market. Pretty simple stuff, right? All right, let's do the next city here. What's next? Only got a couple left. Ogden, Utah. Got a couple Utahs on here. Ogden, Utah, up 16% in inventory. Ogden, Utah, up 28% in days on market. That's a big growth, right? Big. I mean, that's number 2 when you look at the states I highlighted. The second biggest increase in days on market, almost 30% longer to sell a home. Let's find out about prices. Whoops. You can see down here, down 5% in prices. All right, let's do active inventory now and find out where we are. Where are we? The active inventory in Ogden, Utah. Utah's north, Jason. Ogden, Utah, right here. Up 16% in inventory since 2019. About the same level of inventory they actually had back in 2016 right now at 1,700 units. It's not an 8-year high, but it's a lot more than they had in 2019 and a ton more than they had in 2020 or 2021, as you can see from that box. So inventory there dropped off the face of the planet. But then, obviously it's come back to the market. And let's look at prices and see how those are going. Oh, I should have said this too. I just used the top 100 metros. I probably forgot to say that at the beginning, but there it is. I used the top 100 metros only. I didn't look at all the micro markets. There are probably a lot of micro markets that are worse off than the larger metros, but I just used the top 100 metros. Okay, so this is inventory. Whoops, that's prices. We want inventory. Oop, no, we already used inventory, didn't we? We got prices. Ogden, Utah in prices, down 5.1% in prices since the peak. They're up, as you can see, every year overall, and 5-year change, 52%. They're on that 10-year or 10% annual increase on average still. So, the sky's not falling yet in Ogden, Utah, but man, they are definitely building inventory, and it's taking a lot longer to sell houses than it did back in 2019. So that's an area that could definitely crash in 2025, no doubt. Okay, let's look at the last city on my map. Last city, Salt Lake City, Utah, another Utah. 13% increase in active listings. 26% increase in how long it takes to sell a home. And they're down nearly 6% in prices versus the peak in 2022. So let's go back to inventory here. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Go back to inventory and look at Salt Lake City. 2,800 units for sale right now. That is not an 8-year high because it looks like they had 3,200 back in 2018. But certainly more than they had in 2019 as far as active listings. Now let's look at prices in more detail for Utah. Salt Lake City, Utah, down 5.8% in prices since the peak. Similar story to Ogden, where they haven't, if you just look at year over year from November to November to November, you're going to see 2% increase in 1 year, 2% in 2 years. That's kind of interesting, right? It's been flat from the 2-year to the 1-year change. 3%, 3-year change, 7% increase, 4-year change, 30%, and 5-year change, 48%. Almost that 10%, average over the last 5 years. And maybe it's stabilized there as long as there's not a ton of inventory hitting the market. This is my list again. Colorado Springs, Colorado, Austin, Cape Coral, Florida, Spokane, Washington, Denver, Colorado, Phoenix, San Antonio, New Orleans, Ogden, Utah, and Salt Lake City, Utah. Again, remember, there are other areas on this list, right, where inventories exploded more than some of these, some of the cities I put in the top 10, like Lakeland, Winter Haven, Florida, Memphis, Tennessee, Palm Bay, Florida, Orlando, Tucson. You get the point. But they didn't make the top list over here on all three data sets. They could have hit two of them, but they didn't hit all three. So that's why I left them off the top 10. Again, I want to know what you think about my list. Do you live in one of these areas? Do you think there's another area that I'm not mentioning that'll crash more than what I'm showing here? But I hope this helped. Now, we're going to look at what experts think will happen to 2025 home prices. So I've cobbled this together from various sources, and I've added some interesting folks on here. And a lot of this is based on Resiclub Analytics and some of the articles they put out recently. So this first column here is the source, meaning what expert gave their opinion, 2024's prediction, if I could find it. In other words, what was their prediction back in 2024, the beginning of 2024, and then what actually happened year to date, almost the end of the year today, right? We're near the end of the year. So what actually occurred this year? How close were they, right, in their prediction? And then what's their 2025 prediction? So you can see I've got Morgan Stanley, NAR, Moody's, CoreLogic, Housing Wire, Goldman Sachs, Apollo Global, Redfin, Zillow, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. I've got some YouTubers on here. I've got Melody Wright. She's always talking about doom and how we're done for every year. You've got Real Estate Mindset, Travis. He's kind of on Melody's bus there. Got Housing Nerd. That's me. And I also put in here Reventure Consulting because I actually saw Nick Gurley's prediction for 2025, and he's not predicting a housing market crash. I couldn't believe it. So out of all these, when you look at them, there's a couple outliers. One is that for the 2025 prediction, Melody Wright is probably the most bearish. She predicted that home prices would drop 10% in 2025. It's important to point out, she also said home prices would drop 5% in 2024. They did not. We're actually up 6% according to the latest Redfin data. Real Estate Mindset said -5 as well. Swing and a miss, 6% growth according to Redfin data. I haven't heard his 2025 prediction because he hasn't been doing much real estate info lately. My prediction for 2024 was 5%. We did 6. Next year in 2025, I think nationally we'll do 2.5% according to Redfin's index. Reventure Consulting, he's saying 0.9% increase next year. Nick Gurley at Reventure actually says no housing crash next year, just in basically a flat gain, if you will, nationally based on Zillow data. By the way, Zillow predicts that we'll grow 2.6% in 2025. Now, the biggest bull in all of it is Apollo Global. They think we're going to grow 10.8% in 2025. 10.8%, which seems kind of ridiculous, but they we'll have to see, if they're right or not. It'll be interesting. But overall, if you average all of the predictions out, you get an average of 2.2% growth for 2025. So I think that's something to pay attention to. It's like, hey, overall, all these experts wrapped up into one super expert, I guess you could call it, even with some of the nutty predictions from Melody Wright and Apollo Global, one side 10% up, one side 10% down. Through all that, you get a 2.2% overall increase. That kind of makes sense because inventory is tied so much at the hip to prices. I wanted to show you this chart to round out the video. This gives us an idea of active inventory for sale, where it could go in 2025, also where it's kind of been coming from over the last few years. So in 2017, and this chart is from Resiclub Analytics, in 2017, November, we had around 1.1 million units for sale of houses. You can see it goes down and up with seasonality, obviously. And then it started to travel down right around, actually before the pandemic, but when the pandemic hit, it really bottomed out, right? You can see active units went all the way down to under 400,000 active houses for sale in the entire US. So what happened? Well, We got out of that slump, started building more inventory. Okay. Following seasonality, going up. And now, according to three experts, Housing Wire, Bright MLS, and Realtor.com, it looks like we're going to see housing inventory hit 1.1 million units or so in 2025. So if you're hoping for a housing market crash, if this info is right, you're not going to get it because we don't have enough inventory. At the same time, if you're thinking prices are going to skyrocket up like Apollo does, up 10%, well, this info can't be right because you're going to need to see inventory actually fall, in my opinion, to get prices to go up again 10% year over year. So this tells me that we're not going to see a massive price increase. We're not going to see a massive price crash. That 2.2% on average, when you average all the experts out, that kind of makes sense to me. Actually, Nick Gurley's Reventure Consulting call of 0.9% isn't bad either. I don't think it seems like that's like a probable scenario. My call again is 2.5%. We'll see if that happens. But if you have so folks like Apollo up 10% seems crazy. Melody Wright down 10%. That seems crazy too. Just need more inventory. So that's what you want to watch, folks, is inventory. Watch new listings and active inventory to find out if the housing market is going to crash nationally next year. And if you're in your local market, that's what I'd pay attention to. I'd look at your local inventory to find out where inventory is today compared to 2019, how that's trended. Then watch it like a hawk in the subdivision, in the school system, in the area you want to buy in. Watch that active inventory. Watch the absorption rate. How long does it take houses to come off the market? And that'll give you a picture of where prices could probably head coming up. Anyway, I hope that this info helped. I also have a video that talks about where mortgage delinquencies are because a lot of people think we're going to get this explosion of inventory from foreclosures. You should check that out now. It's in the video right here.